I came back inside from giving my 3 younger kids haircuts to talk about the update in the Abrego Garcia case, and in the hour that I was outside cutting hair, there has been another development in the story. Today, Wednesday, July 23rd, around lunchtime, my time, we heard that Kilmar Abrego Garcia was going to be released. He is currently being held in criminal custody in Tennessee and has been ordered to be returned to Maryland. Earlier this year, Abrego Garcia's case hit the headlines because at that time, the Trump regime was rounding up Venezuelan immigrants, claiming that they were gang members based on their tattoos. Even though that's like not a thing, there's not specific gang tattoos that they were looking for. They were just looking for any Venezuelan who had tattoos. A young man who had an autism awareness tattoo was snatched by ICE, who claimed that that was proof he was a gang member. I know I covered this back then, but law enforcement in the United States, federal law enforcement, FBI, ICE, has a history of claiming that someone's tattoo is proof that they are in a gang, when there is no such thing. I mean, this was the justification of the Federal Bureau of Investigation claiming that fans of Insane Clown Posse and Insane Clown Posse themselves were all members of a gang. I have an old video on that. Feel free and go back and watch it on my YouTube. At the time, this was a dramatic escalation by the Trump regime, and a lot of people, especially conservatives, believed the misinformation from right-wing media claiming that these men were gang members. And they're like, okay, Trump is fulfilling his campaign promise to round up violent criminals, right? Trump at one point claimed that there were millions of rapists and murderers, folks who are waiting to, either abduct you or break into your home, who were streaming across the border. There were all of these gang members that he was letting in, and he was going to protect America. A lot of the reason that we saw conservatives voting in favor of his immigration policy is because they believed the lie that his intent was to remove all of these gajillion criminals from in our midst and send them back across the border. I think it's incredibly abundantly apparent to all of us now that that was never his intent. I mean, those of us who weren't MAGA hats knew that all along, that his intent was to use immigrants and deportation to ramp up his authoritarianism, because that's like what authoritarians do all over the world. It's abundantly clear to all of us now that what Trump is doing is an ethnic cleansing. But at that time, an awful lot of people were willing to relinquish our due process rights because they were fine with these men being snatched up, denied due process, and immediately shipped across the border, renditioned to a torture gulag in El Salvador. None of these men had been accused of any crimes. None of these men had been charged with any crimes. None of these men had been convicted of the crimes that Pam Bondi speculated about. Oh, I'm sure they're all criminals. They're all gang members. No, they were denied any due process. If you don't have due process, how do you determine if someone is innocent or guilty? If you don't have due process, how are you able to defend yourself from accusations made by the government? And what we saw in that situation was the government declared these folks to be gang members without ever charging them, without ever going before a judge, without ever supplying any evidence, no conviction, no due process whatsoever. And so many people were fine with that because they believed right-wing media and Pam Bondi and the Trump regime saying, these guys are all violent gang members. So we can stick them in a torture gulag where the director of that facility said the only way that you leave is in a coffin. Even though we know now, we knew then, but nobody wanted to hear it, that a lot of those men were here on asylum. They were here working through the green card process. They're not criminals. Now, thankfully, this past week, the United States did a prisoner exchange, and most of those folks have been sent back to Venezuela, although a number of them here, again, were on asylum because it wasn't safe for them to be in Venezuela in the first place. So at the time, I was really freaking out. A lot of people were freaking out because what was happening was something that happened in 1930s Germany. If you can take somebody out of this country where there are protections from cruel and unusual punishment, where there's due process, and you can plunk them in another country, they can be subject to so many more human rights violations. And you can be like, oh, well, they're not within our borders anymore. It's a classic technique to claim that you don't have any power over the awful things that happen to these people. You can't stop it because they're no longer within your borders. But you've also put them in a prison, potentially for life, a gulag, a concentration camp, potentially for life, where all kinds of egregious things can be done to them because there are far fewer restrictions in that facility than there are within our own borders. And right away at that time, Trump was already saying he wanted American citizens. He wanted El Salvador, Bukele and El Salvador, to build 6 more of those torture gulags where he wanted to send American citizens. And not enough people were really freaked out about that, about the Trump regime saying that he was going to snatch American citizens or take them out of prisons in the United States and send them to a foreign country where they have no due process, no access to attorneys, they can't interact with their family, and there is a long list of egregious human rights violations that have been committed in those facilities. But what did capture everybody's attention at that time was that when all these Venezuelan men were sent, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who is from El Salvador, was sent as well. He was snatched up in these raids, and he was sent to the torture gulag known as Sicat with all of these Venezuelan men. And part of the reason that this story captured everybody's attention is because from the get-go, the Department of Justice was like, oh, we done fucked up. We should not have sent him. They knew that there was an order of protection from a judge that stated that Abrego Garcia could not be returned to El Salvador because it was dangerous for him to be there. The Department of Justice admitted that they violated that order by sending him into a torture prison. They also admitted that he had done nothing wrong. He should not have been picked up. He should not have been deported. And then they said, oh, well, we can't get him back. Guess he's there now. That is what captured America's attention. And because you cared about this issue, and because activists and independent journalists continued to emphasize that this was not okay, something has to be done, we all pressured our members of Congress to fucking do something. And we saw Abrego Garcia's Senator Holland, actually went to El Salvador and brought the press with him. He made a big stink about it. He ultimately was able to get an interview with Abrego Garcia. And at the time, the Trump regime and Pam Bondi were like, nothing we can do. We don't have the power to bring him back. It became a Supreme Court case because a judge ordered that they effectuate his return. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't make him do that, but they have to facilitate it. And then we saw the Department of Justice stalling judges over and over again. So the Department of Justice did their own job of keeping it in the headlines. And then we saw my Congresswoman Maxine Dexter, as well as Representative Maxwell Frost, Representative Robert Garcia, and Yasmin Ansari, who's a Congresswoman from Arizona. They, on their own dime with their own money, because Congress wouldn't pay for it, flew down there and demanded to see Abrego Garcia. That happened because you pressured them. That happened because you were on the horn being like, this is wrong, do something about it. I know that it feels like Congress is not able to do anything right now, but please understand there are progressive members of Congress who want to help. They still need to hear from their constituents. Republican members in their district, Republican constituents in their district, they're calling and screaming at those electeds all the time. But Democrats, not as much. They need you to keep the pressure on. They need to be able to go to their colleagues and say, look at this tally. 1,000 people called me about this issue this week. There are members of Congress who want to represent you. They want this to be a representative democracy, and that means that they have to hear from their constituents. It is because of public pressure on elected officials that this case did not drop out of the headlines, and ultimately, Abrego Garcia was brought back to the United States. That's because there are judges who continue to hold the line for the rule of law. That is because tremendous public pressure made it such that the Department of Justice could no longer dick around on this issue. And that's because pressure from elected representatives who are listening to you and felt you pushing them up to the line and saying, do your job. That all of those things together brought Kilmar back to the States. And then immediately we saw Pam Bondi and these trumped up charges against Abrego Garcia, which I'm not an attorney, but other attorneys have absolutely lambasted those charges as being completely ridiculous. So that's why Abrego Garcia is in custody now, because of these ridiculous charges. And today, a judge ordered that he be released from criminal custody. And then immediately, right after, another judge said, hey, ICE has threatened that if y'all let him out of prison, that they will just snatch him up again and try to deport him. And so a judge issued an order saying that he cannot be re-detained by immigration authorities. So Judge Crenshaw said the pieces of evidence that the government cites, taken alone or together, warrant a finding that Kilmar is at best a low risk of non-appearance. The court agrees with Abrego that the nature of the crimes he is accused of do not on their own fall within the category of crimes Congress specifically enumerated as warranting a presumption of detention. And then minutes after, Judge Zinnes issued an order blocking the government from taking Abrego into immigration custody. Unfortunately, another judge has halted that release for 30 days.